Welcome, everyone. Suzanne Inewi, Marketing Manager at AUC Press and Bookstores. Thank you for joining us tonight or today, according to your local time, for our book discussion on our latest publication, Educating Egypt. I don't know if you can see the cover. Yes, Educating Egypt, Civic Values and Ideological Struggles by Professor Linda Herrera. Our talk tonight should last for an hour or so, and it's being recorded and we're live on Facebook page, the American University in Cairo Press, and it's gonna be available afterwards also on our YouTube channel if you would like to watch the recording. After our discussion with Professor Kenneth Cuno, we're gonna have a Q&A session. If you'd like to ask any questions, please type them in the Q&A box you can find at the bottom of your screen, and we're gonna answer them. If you type it in the chat box, you might miss it, okay? Also, our viewers on Facebook, if you have a question, please type it in the comment box and we're gonna ask it for you. So if you would like to purchase a copy of the book, you can find it at major bookstores worldwide and online book retailers as well. And in Egypt, you can find it at AUC bookstores and Diwan. So let me start by introducing our guest for tonight, Professor Linda Herrera. Professor Herrera is a professor at the Department of Education, Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's a social anthropologist with regional expertise in the Middle East and North Africa. Her research deals broadly with the cultures and politics of education, youth, and citizenship, international development policy, and the social effects of digital transformation. Her books include Cultures of Arab Schooling with C.A. Torres, Revolution in the Age of Social Media, Wired Citizenship, Global Middle East with A. Bayet. And our discussant tonight is Professor Kenneth M. Cuno. He's the Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Illinois. His most recent book is Modernizing Marriage, Family, Ideology, and Law in 19th and early 20th century Egypt, published in 2015, which was awarded the Albert Hourani Book Prize by the Middle East Association. Welcome both of you, and thank you for joining us for tonight's talk. It's our pleasure to host you. And Professor Herrera, I'm gonna leave the floor now to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan, and everyone at AUC Press for organizing this and for being so incredibly supportive during this journey. Recently, I met an old friend, an education friend, just about a week ago, and he was asking about the book, and he asked me how long it took me to write it. And I kind of paused for a moment, and I started thinking, and I said, I guess about 30 years. Not meaning that I started the manuscript 30 years ago, but it's been a cumulative work that has progressed over 3 decades. Sometimes we stop and we look back at what we've been doing and say, okay, it's time to put this together, put it in a perspective. And I think as you go through time, you can see a little bit more clearly something about how your work is fitting into larger processes of change. So I'm trying to, with this book, look at issues of educational and global change within the incredible context of Egypt. So that's just by way of background, but the actual book has been, I started it, I think I sent the proposal in 2017 to the AUC Press, and then I got involved in working in the new education reforms happening in Egypt, and I had to put it on hold. And then I came back to it about 1.5 years ago. So I'm really happy to be able to discuss it with Professor Cuno, who I took 19th century Egyptian history with when I was a student at AUC. So it's great to come back and discuss the work with him.
Yes, Professor Cuno, you're going to be our discussant for tonight. So if you'd like to start the discussion with Professor Herrera.
Okay, thank you. To begin with, I want to thank Linda and also the staff of the AUC Press for putting this event on and inviting me to be the discussant of the book. And of course, that was an opportunity to read this really, really interesting book, and I learned a great deal from it. Linda has already mentioned that we first encountered each other in the classroom at AUC, and this was in 1986, where she was a study abroad student and I was a first year visiting assistant professor in what was then the Department of Arabic Studies. And so this leads to a point I wanted to make, that I've long had an interest in education in Egypt as a result of having taught for 5 years at AUC and having had many students who were products of the Egyptian educational system, and talking with them, asking, how did you do this, or what did you learn here? What was the approach? I had a rough idea of what was going on in the pre-collegiate classroom, although this book, of course, is much more thorough. So what I wanted to say, begin with anyway, Linda, is by making the observation that this book functions both as a history as well as an ethnography of the pre-collegiate Egyptian school system over the past 70 years, roughly 70 years or so. It's remarkable in the amount of field work you were able to do and the photographs you were able to take. I'm well aware, from having been a researcher in Egypt myself, that field work is extremely difficult to get permission to do. So that's even kudos or mabruk to you for that. This is more remarkable as a result of that. One of the big takeaways for me from the book, though, is was the progressive privatization of education in Egypt over the past 70 years, which may be compared a little bit to what's been going on during the same period in the US. But what I wanted to ask you was whether you could explain how this process of privatization happened, and what have been some of the consequences of that.
Sure, Ken. Let me share my screen. I've prepared a few slides for you all. The share screen is a little tricky. Let me try it again. Okay, you can see the screen?
Not yet.
Oh, okay.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
Okay, very good. So let me start with the point you made about taking photographs and doing research in Egypt. I think that's a really important place to start. So here I've provided the cover of the book and then the original photo. And I wanted also to recognize the very ingenious work of the cover designers who were able to craft such a nice cover from the photograph I've presented them. Yes, it's incredibly difficult to get into schools. And one of the advantages I had was that I was living in Egypt and I could be relatively patient. So to get into the first school, which I describe in the first section of the book, where I'm looking at nationalism and education, it was about a 2-year process. I lost count of all of the offices I went to. AUC facilitated that process a lot. That was a study that I did for my master's thesis in anthropology. So over 2 years, getting permissions, rejections, submitting proposals, AUC security office following up. One day, AUC called me and said, we got the permission. And it was, I'm not really sure how. I didn't get permission to take photos. I got permission to record. So this photograph I took I think the first day, and then the principal told me you don't have permission to take photos, but you can record your interviews. But on a day where we had an extracurricular activities, this was a day with it was Ramadan, and I went and we were waiting for the iftar. Then we could take photographs. People brought their cameras, and it was more informal. So I was able to get this legendary headmistress, the school principal, who I write about in great deal in the book. And then you can also see some of the teachers who were so supportive and provided such a great, warm, and instructive environment for me. So this is me taking a picture of them. That's about all I have from that school. Is in the center. She would come with me sometimes to the school as I was doing field work. So this is a way of getting to the point of, you're asking about privatization. So maybe I should take a step back and say that when I started field work in this Egyptian school in the 1991-92 school year, privatization was not a very big trend. So I was really looking at issues of nationalism and citizenship building. I mean, those were the big questions. How do citizens get forged through this process of schooling? So I was looking at the power relations at the school. I was looking at forces of kind of socialization, the curriculum and the hidden curriculum, as we say in education theory. So it was that year of being in a school and doing an ethnography where I sort of learned about the power relations and the everyday life of the school. And that's what I revisit in the first part of educating Egypt. Oh, we're not there yet. But then it was from about, so I didn't know at the time, and often we don't know the value of what we're doing while we're doing it. But this was sort of the end of an era. So I finished this field work in 1991. You know, we could say we were and I was in Egypt while we were witnessing what many people have called the end of the Cold War. We're no longer talking about the end of the Cold War for some obvious reasons, but that was a time when there was really a change in the global order. In 1989, 1990, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and kind of a change in a global regime, we saw really the rise of new ideas about social policy and the role of education in global change. And that's when the privatization piece started becoming much more prevalent. So the privatization, I mean, you were also in Egypt. We saw in the 1980s, you know, structural adjustment, which was realigning resources in countries. 1990s, there was a lot of liberalization of the economy and society, what some people call the neoliberalization. And then into the 2000s, where we saw even further acceleration of this trend, but connected to the knowledge economy. And that's where we see the, you know, this digital revolution that was also part of the privatization wave. So there was definitely a transition that happened. And I just to again address your question, why is that important? And so I moved from kind of schooling the nation to this new type of schooling and markets, because those are very different objectives. So education used to be considered, from the time of the national struggles up until the 1990s, a public good. This was something that the state should take care of. Yes, there were private schools, but they were not profit-making schools. They were there for more cultural influence. But from the 1990s, we had this combination of schooling should be, yes, a public good, but it should also be a force of the market, and it could be a place to make a profit. So the reason I'm talking about ideological struggles is because there are different ideologies operating simultaneously and in tension with each other as we see the acceleration of this privatization with the old ideas of schooling, you know, the nation. So that's why I'm looking at the changing civic role, the changing role of different actors inside of this educational space. We see not only educators, but a lot of business people. And in the 1990s and early 2000s, a lot of business people who made their fortunes or their money in the Arab Gulf countries and are coming back with a different idea about schooling and the cultural part of how to educate. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So in a nutshell, then what you're referring to is kind of up to about 1990, or when you conducted this first study for your MA thesis, Egyptian education was in a phase that you could call state building. That it was constructed for the purpose of advancing the society, of course, but also building the state, which is a story we've seen elsewhere in the region as well, in the post-independence, post-colonial periods. And then transitioning from that roughly after 1990, or it's after 1990, let us say that the impact hits big time, is an era of marketization or privatization, where, as you say, other agendas come into the education system. Okay, so this leads to another point I wanted to raise with you. and that is that you say that during the Mubarak era, groups under the rubric of political Islam, or what I would call Islamism, were using schools. They ran schools, created schools, and were using schools to create what you call a counter-nationalist project. Can you talk about that and walk us through what that is?
Sure. So one of the things that I started to understand as I was doing the first study about kind of nationalism and nation building through education is there were already conflicts within the space of schooling. So let me just give you a little bit of the history. So there were competing ideas about how to use schools and public institutions for building a citizenry. And there's a history that needs to be written that I definitely don't write, but I'm dabbling in it and trying to provide some context. So from the start of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, the Hassan al-Banna, who you can see on the screen, he was a school teacher working with the Ministry of Public Instruction. So at the time, the Ministry of Education was called the Ministry of Public Instruction. And he understood very well the power of trying of the project of modern schooling to forge a new kind of modern person, or a person that fits in the modern period. He was a product of Darul Uloom, a teacher, a very charismatic teacher apparently, and he encouraged members of the newly formed Muslim Brotherhood to become teachers and to go into the public Egyptian schools, the new network of schools around the country, and to spread some of the ideas that were being developed at the time with the Brotherhood. And you probably also know, people understand this history, that Sayyid Qutb, who became the second most important ideologue after Hassan al-Banna in the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, was also a teacher, a school teacher in the Ministry of Public Instruction, and also had ideas about how to penetrate the new government schools for spreading, for enculturation, or spreading and influencing the youth of the country. So this was already happening. So I tried to, and this is the new part of the book, where I try to build a kind of history about how the Brotherhood in particular, there are a lot of groups that emerged in the 90s, Islamist groups, tried to use the technologies of state power to create a kind of alternative to it. So to try to build not Egyptian national identity, but a Muslim modern identity. So there were already tensions within the system. Privatization brings in a whole new dimension of struggles within the space. So here we see not only the Brotherhood in that space, but we see all kinds of new private business people who have their own ideas how to raise a contemporary Muslim citizen within the schools, who are now not buying schools, but they're establishing schools. They have their own set of rules. Yes, they're using the government curriculum and they have to follow the government exams, but they have their own rituals and culture of schooling. So I do also show in the book these three models of the new private Islamic schools, which were developing as I was doing my dissertation work, and I was able to do also ethnographic work in some of these schools and find teachers and talk to them and try to piece together what was going on. So there was something, while this political Islam was important in education up to the 90s, in the 90s and 2000s, it moved into the market in ways that were changing and creating a new dynamic. So that's something I also tried to bring out and show. I tried to show them, the complexity of these new actors. And in fact, some of these schools were not called private Islamic schools, but Madaris Istithmariya, investment schools. And that was a new category of investment schools with a different way of providing a board of directors and different financial arrangements. So that these were some of the changes that were happening that I tried to highlight. But here I also want to show that, sometimes people misunderstand that if somebody with very conservative views, builds a school or is running a school, he's the principal or maybe the director of the school, that school is necessarily going to be very, conservative and very rigid. But in fact, once you get into the space, you can see all kinds of negotiations happening. And also the government was wary of this Islamization of their private school sector. So we're putting on restrictions and doing some surveillance on them. But one of the things I was really happy to be able to do was to get to know students in the schools. And here's a picture with me with some of the students in one of the private Islamic schools who really walked me through, what was going on. Like they say, to do this. But in fact, we can negotiate, things about our uniform or about the practices or about the punishment. We've changed things. So I tried to show how through ethnography and through talking to students, we can understand how these power relations are negotiated inside of these spaces.
You described, as I recall, you described a situation where the government in its monitoring efforts would send out inspectors to the school. And this one, I think it was one school where you were doing participant observation. They created a kind of Potemkin setup. I can't remember, I think it was in advance of the inspector coming, they put a picture of President Mubarak at the head of the classroom and so forth. And then they took it down after the inspector left. Yes.
And that was a school I didn't visit. I pieced that story together through one of the teachers who I got to know, who said that the school director wanted a permit to expand the school because it was becoming very popular and kids were growing up. They needed to build a preparatory school. But the first time the government inspectors visited, there were all this Islamic memorabilia, nothing national in it. So and they were denied the permit. And the second time the government inspectors came, they put up an Egyptian flag, pictures of Mubarak, took down some of the other, more Islamic oriented symbols around. They kept some, but not all. And they were polite. He was more polite with the inspectors, offered them tea and spoke kindly, but he didn't do that the first time and they were able to get the permit.
Okay. And also, before moving on, I wanted to point out also that in the long history of the Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, it's education from the start, as you pointed out, that Al-Banna was a school teacher by profession, but also during the 1950s, during the period in which the Brotherhood was repressed by the regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser, those who managed to escape the dragnet, many of them went to Saudi Arabia, which was just in the beginning stages of building its public school system from scratch. And of course, the Saudis did not have the personnel to teach in these schools. And so many Muslim brothers were employed there for about 20 years before coming back to Egypt in the 1970s. So there's a long, people talk nowadays about the influence of the Gulf, and particularly the Saudi influence on education in Egypt, but actually the flow has been back and forth, I would say, probably in both directions. So I want to raise another issue that you highlight in the book, what you call digital disruption. That's a nice alliterative term. And you write about this digital disruption, so-called, in relation to the changing learning style of Egyptian students before 2011. And so what does that look like today in terms of both learning and politics?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So if we can go back to trying to think about all the layers of different things happening simultaneously. Nationalism, citizenship building is happening. Schooling is becoming a realm of the market. You have forces of political Islam and repressive state forces against those forces of political Islam playing out in schools. And then you have this digital development, disruption, evolution, which started in the 90s. So when I was doing work in the 90s, we saw from the very beginning, not at that first school, but later on, a lot of the USAID and other international development were really supporting getting computers in school and starting computer literacy. And that accelerated a lot into the 2000s when there was this understanding that Egypt had to become more up to date. There needed to install cables and have, digital accessibility. And that was really disrupting the traditional way of doing things. We can say that started in a way with the mobile phone. So the digital disruption actually started with the phone when students and other people could do mass text messages. And there was in the early years when people were getting phones, a lot of funny jokes or rumors or groups for studying, and that was happening through text message. And as people went online, we saw the rise of an online digital culture. So in 2008 and 9, I started researching how are these new technologies changing the way students or youth learn, communicate, do politics, form, our citizens, form ideas about themselves, their society, the world around them. So that's what I was, I'll get to this one later. That's what I was researching, like just in the couple of years leading up to the Egyptian revolution. So all of these things, there's this collapsing of private and public and schooling and learning, and all of these things are collapsing together. So I just want to give you an example where it looked like something fundamentally is changing among a student youth culture. And here we're looking at, I was looking at high school and university students. So we see this rise of an online youth culture. So getting off of the phones and onto social media. Yes, it's a minority of people at the time, but it's a very powerful minority. You see, students are intervening more in what's happening politically. So there was this famous case, and I tried to get these photos in the book, by the way, but the quality of some of them were not high enough, so they didn't make it there, which is why I wanted to show them. So in September 2010, there were this famous Middle East people with Obama at the White House. But in El Ahram, it appeared with, the photo appeared with Mubarak front and center because it was the Egyptian version. But at that time, but when you have kind of digitally sophisticated and savvy youth online, they're not accepting this story. And they, people were writing this is ridiculous and what's going on. And then you started seeing, and at this time I was on Facebook for research, you started seeing this explosion of memes, just making fun of that. From making multiple Mubaraks to one of the meme creators putting himself at the front of the summit. And there were a lot, there were tens of these kinds of memes. And this signaled a new form of more horizontal communication, which I think blew up for a time. The whole, normal or the traditional modes of authority and regulation. So here are students in these spaces where at the time, we're talking about 2009, 2010, the teachers weren't necessarily there. The authorities weren't there very much. The surveillance softwares that we see today were not really being used because people in authority didn't take this seriously at the time. And of course, we know that a lot of this behavior, it accumulated very fast into youth movements and was very significant in the Tunisian and Egyptian uprisings of 2010, 2011, which is the subject of another book I did, Revolution in the Age of Social Media. But I was but I wanted to come back to schooling and learning to see how is the learning environment going through another change with all of this digital disruption. And that's something that I think needs to be on the radar of, of researchers now, because we don't quite have a good grasp on it.
Okay.
Yeah. And should I go back to
Yes.
should I go back to the privatization piece?
Yes, do, please.
Okay, thank you. So there's privatization, of course, of schools and new investment schools, but we also know that, anyone who knows anything about the Egyptian education space knows there is endemic-ish problem of private lessons. And when I was doing the study in 1990, I write about how that was started to distort the social relations between students, and teachers were competing for students, and there was forced private lessons, which others have written about. But I could also see that this augmenting of private lessons. So there are some really good studies on this. So private lessons used to occur in teachers' homes with groups of 4 to 10. Then we saw the growth in the 1990s with liberalization and privatization. Really innovative, we can say, entrepreneurs who were building private lesson centers with menus. You want, for a higher cost, you can get a star teacher with just 2 people in the class. You can begin a class with 20. You can get a new teacher for less money, So we saw that happening. And then we saw this phenomenon who were like finding, with managers. And this is a model, a photograph of a teacher the day before the Sanawiyya exam, giving a revision in a stadium. Where he had a manager and a bunch of, he had a team who were collecting the money, and then he had the microphone and was going around doing the revision. Apparently he was a very popular teacher. So the privatization is escalating in different spaces. This is the unregulated private lesson space. And then you have the more regulated institutional school space. So I wanted to show this is happening in different ways. And of course, now private lessons and privatization is happening in unregulated digital spaces. So we're in a whole, talking about digital disruption in a really different time right now.
It must have an effect also on the socialization of students if they're spending less time in the classroom or less meaningful time in the physical classroom, where they would be amongst colleagues, their cohort of various backgrounds, and instead they're sort of self-selecting into these particular private academies, or in this case, private lessons. And I'm not really sure if you're prepared to say anything about that, but I think it has also interesting implications for social development. Did you want to speak to that, or?
Absolutely. This is a problem we're seeing worldwide. So for all of the problems of this of mass or national education, it was a place of learning to live on a daily basis with people from different backgrounds, different religions, different attitudes, different temperaments. And that is, one of the advantages of schooling, and one of the ways that for pluralism or living together or managing difference, despite all of the hierarchies and difference within schools. Mm-hmm. That's why I initially started looking at what's happening with the formation of citizens when children aren't spending the same amount of years in schools. So children primary school age are still in schools, and I think those are important spaces. But in middle school and high school, there is very high absentee rates, to the extent that in high school, it's not uncommon just to find empty schools. Students are preparing for these high stakes exams through the informal private market. So yeah, I think that is the right question to ask. So what does that do to the public good, to social solidarity, to creating societies where young people grow up learning how to manage and deal with difference, and we're seeing less of that. And I think that is a problem. And that will increasingly be a problem as we're moving into a new hybrid or distance learning model, which kind of blew up during the COVID pandemic. But it's not going away.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I have one more issue I want to raise before we turn it over to the Q&A. And that is the your discussion in the latter part of the book of the involvement of international agencies, in particular the American USAID, Agency for International Development, their involvement in Egyptian education. And you're effectively saying that the ideas and agendas of these international agencies do not always fit the realities of Egyptian youth. Can you expand on that?
Sure. So one of the things I was doing was, well, let me step back. As I mentioned before, in the post-90 era, when the global order was changing and oriented more towards a global order with a very dominant US, people were talking about the end of the Cold War. And the US was asserting its power, hard power in the region in many ways, militarily in other ways, and soft power. So it was asserting its soft power in the realms of education, civil society, and other areas. So one of the things that we read a lot about in the 90s and 2000s was the attempt for democracy promotion or to liberalize society through education and through civil society. And this is when the youth question became part of a development agenda. So we used to see, development working with education, and then we saw it working on youth projects, youth activities, youth-oriented NGOs. And what I'm trying to show is that, despite a lot of investment and attention to youth, there seemed to be very little listening to what is the condition of youth and what are the problems they see and what is the kind of support. So I started to do oral history interviews with young people to ask, and I actually initially worked on this with a colleague at the University of Alexandria, Dr. Kamel Naguib, who did a book in Arabic. So we were asking, what is the situation? How do you see politics? What about the role of the US? What are the, solutions you see for the impasse that many of you are at with unemployment or frustration or lack of political rights, et cetera? So what I'm trying to say is a lot of the programming was tone deaf. It wasn't really participatory, although it was a methodology often you hear in development, we're listening to local voices, but in fact, it was pretty top down. And I tried to show how that looks in some of the policies for entrepreneurship. There's been a lot of advocating and supporting entrepreneurship as a solution to youth unemployment. And I'm trying to show, the connection between what happens to someone who graduates from the education system and they're expected to become an entrepreneur and what that means at the time trying to become entrepreneurs. And I also look at some of the programming around the curriculum in the 90s and 2000s. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, more or less, yeah. And it strikes me that there's kind of a parallelism here, because on the one hand, in the other section of the book that you've already discussed, you're dealing with privatization, and in particular the role of Islamists, Muslim Brothers, but now since then others, in promoting a particular approach to education. And then on the other hand, in the same period of time, you've got the Americans with their efforts to influence Egyptian public education too. And so one of the takeaways I have from that is that what some political scientists would call permeability of Egyptian policy making in this case, especially in the area of education, such that although you still have a Ministry of Education and you have the physical plant, the school buildings, increasingly it seems that there are these other forces other than the state that are actually influencing the content of education, the way it's delivered, and as you put it, the hidden agenda, which I think is a very interesting way of putting it. So this more or less, I mean, I could go on and on, but I've reached the end of what I prepared to, the points I prepared to raise. And so if Susan wants to take over again, and it seems that we have some questions queued up.
Yes, we do. Let me start by reading some of them. Okay. First of all, we have Vicky Jacobs. She's asking, did your research on field work lead you to any tribes? Do tribal populations get their own schools, or are they integrated due to nationalism trends? How has this education system impacted people like the Bedouins, etc.?
I haven't personally done research on tribes. I haven't really gone out of urban centers. So their education does look different in rural and tribal areas. How does it impact? I know that there has been, that the state definitely wants to incorporate the Bedouins into the national projects, and there are mobile schools that go to tribal areas, but I can't speak with authority on that specific question.
Okay. Next question from Carol. She's saying, I'm interested to know your opinion on the growth and impact of the international school system in Egypt. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? And you also had someone else asking previously, how do you think it's going to affect that more and more Egyptians are learning or studying in foreign language schools, and many cannot even read or write in Arabic?
No, this is a good question, and people talk a lot about this. I see some parallels historically with the missionary schools, and maybe Professor Cuno can also speak to that. There was a concern in the 19th century and early 20th century about the impact of the foreign schools on Egyptian society, because Egyptians were learning the ways of the Khawagat, in terms of the type of language and customs and culture. Do I see it as a problem? I see it as something that has always been in society. There have been different institutions and choices for learning, but I think Egyptians often regret that they weren't able to get a good foundation in Arabic in those schools. So there are benefits with language and exposure and access and having more of a international sensibility. But these schools tend to be very elite too. So we're talking about a very small but important elite. But yeah, I do think it's a problem when students in their own country are, do not have a good grasp of language, of their language.
Yes.
If I could weigh in a little bit here too. Yes, the early 20th century critiques of European style education and European language education in the schools were very trenchant, and they were coming from a nationalist position, but not necessarily a bad nationalist position, in the sense that I recall some critiques of girls' education saying, why should they be taught piano and dancing? And this is one of the critique was from one of the leading Egyptian feminists, Malik Ibn Nassif, who is better known as Bahithat al-Badia, which was her pen name, a searcher in the desert. She was critiquing this kind of what she thought of as frippery in girls' education, and actually promoting a more domestic education. They should be taught how to be mothers and housewives and things like that. So that was also problematic. I think the key difference between history of education in Egypt and other colonized countries and former colonized countries, as opposed to, say, the US, where we haven't had that experience of colonial construction of our education system, is that content-wise, it was for a long time, the colonial influence was not removed, so that even in the 1930s, for example, a leading critic of education in Egypt said that, well, you come out of arts, and you can talk about the major products of different cities in Great Britain, but not from Egypt. And this isn't from coming out of Egyptian schools. And this is because the curriculum was still this Britishized curriculum. So that's a long-term problem. The language issue also was something I encountered at AUC with some of my undergraduates. In particular, it was particularly acute with students who were the children of business people or diplomats and had grown up mostly overseas in Europe or America, and were not all that literate in Arabic. The more common issue, though, was with students who were fluent in Ammiya, colloquial Arabic, because they had to speak it to their gardeners and their servants. But they had studied science and English and maybe studied literature and French, and so they were trilingual. But they weren't accustomed to writing serious prose in Arabic, and weren't necessarily, because of going to language school, they weren't necessarily exposed to some of the classics of Arabic literature, which ironically, I in my Orientalist training did get a bit of at UCLA. So there is that, and this question of how do you stay in touch with your heritage, but also how do you resolution to that, but that's what I have to say. Are there other questions?
Yes, we have. We have someone asking, is education universal in terms of gender, age, and social class? And we have other questions they're asking about the growing gap in the education between the expensive private schools for the wealthy and the privileged Egyptians versus the state-run schools for the large majority of Egyptians. And does this not just crystallize the class difference in society?
Yeah, of course. There is a lot of social inequality in Egyptian society, and we can see that in educational choice. I mean, that's the language of privatization. So, but yes, in the Constitution, education is universal, not only right, but it's a requirement. We're talking about the pre-university education. It's by law free and open to everyone. But yes, there is a lot of variety and choice within society. And I do think this leads to a kind of social, or perpetuates social inequality. This is not something new, that there are different kinds of schools, as long as there's enough resources and attention put into the public sector schools. And that's a long-standing problem, not having enough resources. Egypt has a huge system, 34 million students in K-12, growing with a very high population growth. So that's always a challenge.
Someone is asking if you could speak to the ideological trends among that generation. Not sure which generation specifically she's referring to. But also we have another question about Alexandria in 1990s. Catherine Van de Weet said she saw that Islamists were supporting cheap private lessons on a large scale, which put pressure on local Egyptian state or authorities to offer the same and more, almost like a competition. Were Islamists a driving force in offering private lessons, or only one of the several trends?
Yeah, so one of the things we saw was these parallel activities. So when the Islamists were offering cheap private lessons, you see government services coming in and offering cheap private lessons. There was this competition in the services when Islamists were, and here I think we're talking about the Brotherhood primarily, offering subsidies for housing for students coming from rural areas into the cities for universities. Government tried to do the same thing. So you see, so I talked about the Islamists using the technologies of state power to provide an alternative, but they also provided camps and private lessons and clothing and books at the ways that non-Islamist NGOs and some government projects were doing. So we saw this parallel happening, and I believe it's still happening.
Okay, going back to the question that was not clear about, could you speak to the ideological trends among the generation of the post-Cold War?
Mm-hmm. So there are definitely different trends, ideological trends. So let me take you before the post-Cold War. I think before that time, Arab nationalism was a very strong idea that very much informed a lot of what was happening ideologically. So prior to Arab nationalism, the content of schools, and we can look back historically, look different. So a lot of the dominant force became sort of Arab and Muslim in that kind of Arab nationalist wave. In the post-Cold War area, we could see ideologically more of an adaptation of the value of the markets. So this doesn't mean that erases Arab nationalism or erases identification with Islam or whatever, but it brings in a new dimension. So you have a lot of not only policymakers, but people in society agreeing that, okay, I need to, up until we get to today, I need to find a way to market myself. I need to find a way to brand myself. That's the way to get, a job, or that's the way to get attention. So this evolution of market until it comes into self-branding and entrepreneurship, I think that has become a very powerful ideological message that many people have adapted and are working on this new kind of ideology, in addition with some of the old ones. These are layers that happen and build up.
Okay, we have a question from Lauren Clark from Atlanta, Georgia. She's saying hello, and she would like to know your thoughts on the teachings of social studies in international schools in Cairo, Egypt, and if the method of teaching is truly empowering Egyptian students with an international understandings of Egypt's connection to the international world.
Well, I mean, this is a question that requires really serious research. So I can't comment on it because I haven't studied the teaching of social studies in international schools, but I think there are people who are looking at international schools. So that, and I also want to say, one should be careful about commenting on things that they don't know. And, so I just will say, I don't know enough to be able to answer that question.
Well, based from my personal experience as a previous student in Egyptian schools, it's not up to date. I hope they updated it.
But Egyptian schools are going through, and this is important to say.
Yes.
There is a new education system that is being built. It's called Education 2.0, and I've been working on documenting that. And from kindergarten through grade 4 today, there are completely new books. And they will continue until grade 12. So there is a fascinating shift happening in the education system, which needs a lot of attention. Those new books are online. People can start studying them. You can start familiarizing yourself with this new education system that is as we speak, being built. But I thought the question was about the international schools, not the national schools. Yeah.
another question that's almost related to what we were discussing is how engaged is the Ministry of Education in modernizing the current curriculum, like introducing critical thinking rather than memorizing?
Okay, so now we're moving up to the new Ministry of Education. So since 2018, we have had a new minister, Dr. Tariq Shawi, and we have had him and his team that are developing and very hands-on developing a new education system, which they hope will bring critical thinking, multidisciplinary learning, a new way of dealing with material. I'm going to share a slide with you. So yes, there is an attempt, and it's still early days, but there is a lot of, right now, a lot of resources and efforts are being put into this new education system. And in fact, I'm working on the next book, which is actually looking specifically at that with some other colleagues who are working on it. And we have a lot of oral histories with people who have been very instrumental in this new system. But just to show you, there are all of these official e-learning platforms now. We are really moving into a radically, I think, new era in education. So my book kind of ends before, you know, it just mentions this new era that we're moving into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you see the education system in the next couple of years? I mean, after COVID, I think a lot of things have changed. The hybrid model has become more acceptable. Do you think that the current school system is going to change forever?
Yes, I do. I think we are globally, not only in Egypt, we're on the precipice of a new way of thinking about, not only thinking about, but actualizing education. We are no longer only in the brick and mortar, you know, school phase. And this has been happening for some decades, but the COVID-19 really acted as an accelerant of people accepting, okay, we have to watch some lessons on television. We need to upload things onto the learning management system. We have to get to the Egyptian Knowledge Bank to find the interactive textbooks. I think we have reached a new phase. And that's $1 million question. What does it look like in 2 years? What are the unintended consequences of all of these changes that are happening before our eyes at such a fast pace? So yes, for sure, schooling is looking different already, but we're not quite sure. But it's up to us to manage it and to make sure it's the schooling we want, not the schooling that just comes because of change. So there are, sometimes you have to put on the brakes, you have to stop and think, okay, is this working? If not, how do we retool? And I think that's happening within society and within the ministry right now. You know, on different sides, everyone's trying to manage what this new system and environment looks like.
Yeah, and speaking of it also, Dr. Hanan Sebei is asking, how realistic is the current reform that you mentioned a couple of minutes ago with the available infrastructures, like the internet connection and the training of teachers, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it's uneven. I know there's a lot of effort to be put on internet connections. Not everybody has a good connection. So the solution to that has to make sure that every lesson from year 4 is on television, that students can go to schools where they can get connections. I mean, there are definitely problems. There are some gaps. The system is not going to, you know, work perfectly, but I think there's a lot of effort right now to work with teachers. Of course, it's a massive force in Egypt, and yeah, the teachers aren't yet really trained on these kind of what we call education futures. But there is a lot of resources and effort to try. And yes, it's going to be hard and imperfect, but it's moving.
Okay, I think we have the time for just one last question. Someone is asking if they would like to hear from you about how does it feel to be part of the private lessons in Stadium, especially from a student perspective, and how does it impact the learning culture in Egypt?
So, I mean, I can't speak to how it feels. I wasn't part of that, but I can say from somebody looking at it, it just seems that things have gone out of control. at least before, it was a time of forming some kind of community with a group of your fellow students. It was a time of forming a relationship with a teacher. You got some individual attention. But I'm trying to show that as it scales up, you lose all that individual, community building and pedagogic attention to you. And I think as it scales up now to online, where we have private lessons, through YouTube and social media, through WhatsApp groups and through Facebook, where it can scale indefinitely to thousands and thousands, you also lose that personalized learning. So that's what I am concerned about, that it becomes so anonymized and depersonal, that what is education, what is pedagogy, what are relationships that are supposed to build around this process.
I have to say, from my personal experience in Thanawiya Amma, I was unfortunate to have to attend one of these mega revisions before the exam in a large auditorium where the professor had like a mic, and I could not hear anything, I could not understand anything. I prefer to go home and study by myself because I got no use out of it. So yeah, I agree, it's completely detached you from everything that's happening. You don't get any benefit from it except seeing your friends maybe, but that's it.
And that's a shame. And that's something we have got to figure out as a society and, global and local, how to mitigate some of these things, which are not good for anyone. Not, except maybe the teacher who's getting all these thousands of students.
I have one last question, if you'd like, if you could just answer it quickly. How do you perceive the initiatives that are made by enthusiastic individuals or local NGOs to contribute in filling the educational gap student experience?
I'm not really sure what that question refers to. So I think it's that maybe as schooling goes hybrid or it's less individualized, NGOs can fill the gap, build community. I think we'd have to look at the initiative. I mean, not all initiatives are equal, but of course, civil society is, has been and continues to be important, but it's highly regulated. There's not a lot of space right now or flexibility in civil society. But I wanted, if you would allow me, if I could just close with how I close the book, because there's so many questions that have been raised that I certainly don't have the answers to, but I like to encourage people to think about how we think together about education futures. So what I have written and how I think is the thing about educational research is you can never know what will take you. One needs to be nimble enough to follow where it leads and humble enough to know that you can only ever scratch the surface. But as we march further into a 21st century laden with perils and unknown consequences, but also abounding in opportunities, we try to take stock of the past and envision a future. In the throes of overwhelming structural and resource challenges, contentious politics, spectacular technological advances and disruptions, pandemics like COVID-19, we strive to build knowledge and engage in dialogue about how education can best serve and support the common good, the global good. And these are, I think, aspirations we have that we must stick to, and it needs a lot of collective work.
Yes. Well, I would like to take this chance to thank you, Professor Herrera, and also Professor Cuno, for taking the time and walking us through the book and this interesting discussion. And I would like also to thank everyone who joined us today from all over the world, and for the questions. You kept it very interesting, I have to say. And you can find a recording of tonight's or today's discussion on our Facebook page, the American University in Cairo Press, and also on our YouTube channel. And I've put links for purchasing on the page as well. If you'd like to get a copy of the book, you can find it at major bookstores and online book retailers. There is a hardback and a paperback outside of Egypt, but paperback only in Egypt. And it's also available digitally if you'd like to read it on your Kindle. So thank you, Professor Herrera and Professor Cuno, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting this.
Thank you. Goodbye.